8 a.m. and it's 4 degrees centigrade. That's not good. 39 Fahrenheit. That's not good. 71% water in the air. Humidity. 1022 millibars. And the flag, bit of a breeze from the west. Not a lot of breeze, but any breeze, of course, when the temperature's low just makes it feel even lower. Anyway, how are you? How are you doing? Have you had a good week? We're round to Sunday again. We've had a little bit of sunshine this week, but mainly rain, unfortunately. This week I'm going to talk a little bit about fashion, clothes in the 60s, maybe 70s, 80s, hairstyles. What was your hair like back then? I'll also be talking about a load of other rubbish, so please stay tuned. Back in the 60s, most of us had long hair, us lads I'm talking about now. Most of us had long hair. It started at school. I was, early 60s I was at school, and most of the kids had pretty long hair. A lot had short back and sides. Do you remember that? I also remember the fashion was a Boston, which was basically at the back, a straight line. So you go up each side by the ears and then a straight line across the back. That was a Boston. And I don't think it was shaved up the back of your head. That was a short back and sides, which was dreadful. Absolutely awful. I always hated my ears showing. Not that my ears stick out or anything, it's just that I don't like my ears showing. I like them covered, keep them warm, especially in the winter. But a lot of the lads did have longish hair. The teachers, some of them frowned upon that, but I mean most of them didn't care at my school. They didn't give a damn what what you did. As long as they got their wages at the end of the week or their salary at the end of the month, they didn't care what we did. In fact, the teachers, one teacher had pretty long hair. Over his ears, he had a thick head of hair like a mop. He was the art teacher, so he was an arty type, I suppose. He thought it looked good. It did, actually. It did look good. The older teachers, of course, short back and sides, they were balding. The science master, we called him Egghead because he was going bald on top, bit of hair around the side. Very few, if any, of the teachers had a beard. A couple of moustaches, but I don't think anyone had a full beard. Not at my school, anyway. I remember our trousers at school. We called them drain pipes. They had to be not skin tight, but fairly tight and parallel all the way down. No flaring out, nothing like that. Drain pipe, just like a drain pipe. And I remember some kids laughing at me. Mine were slightly too short. It showed my shoes and above my ankle. They used to call that half mast. Your trousers are at half mast. So I got a new pair. I remember that. I got a new pair and I said to my mum, they must be drain pipes. You can't have flares or baggy ones, anything like that. Because at that time, the flares, they were coming in, but they weren't really the fashion. That was a little bit later in the 60s. At school, of course, we had to wear the uniform. So it was shoes, trousers, black shoes. You couldn't wear trainers, stuff like that. We had plimsolls. They weren't called trainers back then. Plimsolls, we call them. I think that varies over different parts of the country. Some call them pumps, are various other names for them. But we had a blazer, white shirt and tie, the school tie, of course. The girls' school up the road, they had their winter uniform, their summer uniform, which was a dress and whatever they wore. They were brown and yellow, if I remember. Not the girls, the uniform. In the 60s, I think for the girls, it was mainly long hair. In fact, it was long hair for the boys and the girls. We all had long hair. That seemed to be the thing. As the 60s wore on, well, we left school, of course, we could wear more or less what we liked to work, depending on where you worked, of course. If you're in an office, you had to wear a shirt and tie and probably a suit. Where I worked in the radio and TV workshop, you could wear what you liked, within reason. I wore red trousers. I had these new elephant cord red trousers, and they were bright red, like pillar box red, electric red. And I remember the first Monday morning I wore them. That was the only time I wore them. The service manager, as I passed him, I saw him. He looked round, and I looked round at him. He looked round at me, frowned, shook his head negatively, and stomped off. So I didn't wear those again. I had various comments throughout the day, red for danger and all this rubbish. So I thought, I'm not wearing those to work again. I just kept those for going out in the evenings. I like those, though. That thick elephant cord in bright red. Fantastic. You could see me coming a mile away. I also had a pair of trousers, turquoise, satin, or silk. I don't know, they're probably not genuine satin or silk, but that's what they look like. Shiny, really nice. And they were flared, hipsters, so they're very, very low, almost dangerously low, tight all the way down and then flared. They were fantastic. I wish I'd kept those. They'd probably fit me now because my legs haven't got big, only my stomach has. I loved those trousers. They were really, really nice. I don't know where I got them from. I'm pretty sure they were second hand because sometimes people would swap, even the lads would swap or sell clothes to each other. I remember I bought a velvet jacket from a friend of mine, crushed velvet, that's the term. That was blue, a very light blue, silvery, grey, it's difficult to explain, crushed velvet with a kind of pattern shaved in the velvet, if you know what I mean. There was one thing I did, a big mistake. My dad used to use Brill cream on his hair. Do you remember that awful white grease stuff, whatever it was? And he used to put that on his hair and comb it all back with a kind of quiff. One morning, my hair was a bit all over the place, I think. I thought, I know, I'll put Brill cream on. Now, my hair was quite long, and I rubbed all this Brill cream into my hair, and it was just grease, basically, just grease. And I combed it all. It looked absolutely dreadful. I didn't have time to wash it off. I went to work, and of course, that was it. All the lads in the workshop, oh, look, there's old Greaseball. What have you done to your hair? They all called me Greaseball. It stank. It was dreadful. As soon as I got home after work, I washed my hair. That was it. In those days, a lot of the older men did use Brill cream, whether they had a short back and sides haircut or long hair. It seemed that a lot of them used Brill cream. The people, the hippies, like me, they didn't use Brill cream. They wanted their long hair flowing. Of course, mine did flow until I covered it in grease. That was the worst thing I'd ever done, I think. I had a pair of black slip-on shoes, not Cuban heel or anything, just ordinary slip-on shoes. And I dyed them purple. I may have told you that before, I can't remember. Really nice. The purple was lovely, but the trouble is, after a few days, or maybe a week or two, the dye, it was like a varnish. It started to crack. And the shoes looked awful. I had to put a load more dye on them, but they still cracked. And in the end, the shoes were ruined. It's a shame because they were fairly new when I first put the dye on them. And basically, I ruined them. Apologies if I sounded a little bit too loud on that last part. I'm just trying to adjust the microphone level just to get it right because I'm planning to do an interview. So I've set up another microphone for my guest. I shall tell you all about that nearer the time. It must be nice to have a proper recording studio with professional equipment where all the levels are set properly and everything works. But not to worry, I'm doing all right. Hello, Jill, living down there in Spain. Hope everything's okay with you. I bet the weather's better than it is here. It's not nice here at all. Swearing. Do you remember we talked about that last Sunday, swearing? Jill says that she listens in the villa where they live, and she's got children. And she says if you started swearing on your podcast, I'd have to turn you off, and I wouldn't listen again because the kids are around. In fact, Jill, yes, I had several emails. Do you remember I was asking people, where do you listen to the podcasts? Some listen in bed, some wherever. Oh, there was one listens in the bath. Do you remember that? I forget who it was. But 2 or 3 people said they listen when they're taking the kids to school in the car. So there are children around. And if I start swearing, then, well, what's going to happen? I'll be turned off. Anyway, nice to hear from you, Jill. As I say, I hope the weather's better where you are than it is here. Going back to fashion in the 60s in particular, because that was my era. My teenage years were the 60s. There was no real fashion. There was nothing that everyone wore, the in thing. Yes, the girls, majority of them wore miniskirts. That was the in thing. Us lads wore flares in the 60s. That was the in thing. But in the main, people wore whatever they liked. I think that's what I liked about the 60s, clothes-wise. People wore whatever they wanted to wear, and they didn't look out of place. I remember the lads at work, Friday. Right, we're off out tonight. We'll go here or we'll go there. Who's with us? Yep. And someone would shout out, suits. OK, we'll all wear suits tonight. So in the 60s, we wore suits, or suits as some people say. I just say suit because I'm common. I think it is suit, isn't it? It's a suit. Or you could wear jeans. Well, no, not always wear jeans. Not some of the clubs didn't like jeans, the nightclubs, they wouldn't let you in. But if you had a suit on, or ordinary pair of trousers that were flared, then you were fine. If you were just going to the pub, of course, you could wear, well, within reason, whatever you liked. And of course, with the girls, there were the miniskirt type girls, mini dresses, and the knee-length white PVC or plastic boots, or the hippie girls who had their long hair all over the place, a big dress covered in flowers and, I don't know, all sorts of weird clothes, which was great. Their clothes were colourful. I was a hippie. I wore all sorts of weird things. I remember my mum saying, why do you wear hats all the time? I did. I used to love hats. I'd wear a hat wherever I went, and sometimes with flowers in the hat. Why not? I wear strange things now. Well, not strange in themselves, but things that don't match, colours that clash. My sister-in-law said once, only you could wear red shoes, Ray, with those jeans or whatever it was. I know it was a top, I think, different colour. Only you could wear red shoes. I love red shoes. I've got 2 or 3 different pairs of red shoes. They're really nice. I've probably banged on about this before, but these days, for men, for males, there are no colourful clothes. You go out for a jacket or trousers, you basically got navy blue, black or grey. That's it. Horrible. They're not even colours, are they? They're just drab. I do have some jeans. I've got some purple jeans. They're nice. Maroon colour jeans. They're nice as well. But they're very difficult to find. You won't find them locally. Well, not in my town anyway. You go down to the shops and have a look around the clothes shops. It's just dull, horrible stuff. Whereas for the women, I've always said this, all my life I've moaned about this. For the women, there are colourful tops, colourful skirts, colourful trousers and all sorts of colourful things. And we have to go around in dull, drab, grey or whatever. It's not fair, you know, it's not right. I said I've moaned about that all my life. I didn't moan about it in the 60s. The lads and I would take a trip up to Carnaby Street and buy all sorts of colourful clothes. Wonderful. Something else that comes to mind is the price of clothes. For men, trousers, jeans, they're all quite expensive. For ladies, they can go and pick up a skirt or a top for a few pounds. Trish has done that. We've been down the town, not very often because I don't like it down there. She'll wander into a shop and there'll be a nice top there for, I don't know, £3 or £4. There'll be a skirt there for £3 or £4. Whereas me, I start looking at men's clothes. Trousers are expensive. Jackets. The last jacket I bought, which was quite a few years ago, £80. 80 quid. It's a nice jacket, but come on, £80. And if I remember correctly, that was reduced from whatever. I'm going to bring Trisha in on this in a minute. I've set the other microphone up. She's not the guest I was talking about. That's a little bit in the future. I'm just preparing for that. But I want to bring Trisha in because my teenage years were the 60s. Hers were the 70s. I remember the cars in the 60s. There was a fashion then, a sort of a fashion with the interior of your car, whatever you did to the interior. People used to stick fur on the dashboard. They go to the second-hand shop and buy an old fur coat and cut it all up and stick fur on the dashboard. I did that in my Hillman Minx. It looked awful. Looking back, thinking about it now, it was dreadful. But of course at the time, oh, fantastic. A furry dashboard. Why people wanted a furry dashboard, I've no idea, but they did. I did. Probably because a lot of other people did. I remember there was one car in the town. He'd wallpapered his car, ordinary flowery wallpaper. He must have spent hours, very carefully wallpapered the whole car. And it was, I forget exactly, dark, sort of blue wallpaper covered in flowers. And it looked, I don't know, what did it look? Awful or brilliant? Depends on your viewpoint, I suppose. But you could see his car coming a mile away. That was quite funny. I don't know how long it lasted in the rain, of course, because surely after some time the wallpaper would have washed off. I don't know. And there was a Volkswagen, the camper. Do you remember the camper vans? that was covered everywhere, covered in fur. He must have bought a dozen fur coats and cut them up, or more than a dozen. The entire van was fur. The trouble is, in the wet, in the rain, it just looked awful. I remember seeing it in the rain. It didn't look too bad in the summer weather. I think he must have brushed it like you have to brush your hair. It didn't look too bad at all, but when it was wet, it was just disaster. Shame, because those camper vans, they're valuable, aren't they? They're worth a lot of money these days. I suppose the fur could have been taken off. Depends how he stuck it on. You'd probably have to rub the thing down, the whole van, and respray it. Then there was the aerial craze. You could buy these 6-foot fiberglass whip-type aerials, and most people stuck a flag on top, a little triangular flag or whatever they had. And these aerials, these huge things, would wave around as you're driving along. I think they were on a spring at the bottom. So they waved around all over the place. And even on the back of scooters, remember the old Lambrettas, people had 6-foot aerials on the back of those with a flag on. Just going back to hair for a minute, I remember when my hair was very long. It was quite fine, light brown, fine hair. I used to back comb it. Can you imagine blokes doing that these days? I'd back comb my hair before I went out. It's because it was so fine. I remember someone saying to me, was it my mum or a girlfriend, as it's so fine, stop it waving all over the place, back comb it. Struth, imagine if I did that now. Actually, I have got enough hair to do that now. I've got a good head of hair. I also remember teenage lads, friends of mine, they would they'd get their mums or their sisters, is it foundation cream you used to have, put all over your face? They dab that on spots, because some of the lads as teenagers, they had spots, red spots on their face, and they dab their mother's foundation cream or whatever it was called on these spots to disguise them, to hide them. And it did work until about halfway through the evening when they're rubbing their face and slopping beer everywhere. It sort of washed off. Honestly, the things people did back then. I bought a pair of brown leather boots, Cuban heel leather boots, that went up to my knees. And I only wore them a few times. I didn't like them. Well, I liked them, but people would look at me. I tried tucking my jeans into the boots, and I looked like, I don't know, some sort of, I don't know what I looked like, dreadful. And then I had to try and fit my jeans over the boots, and I thought, well, there's not much point in having boots up to my knees if they're covered with my jeans. I only wore them 2 or 3 times. I don't know what happened to them. I probably gave them away or swapped them for something else. As I said earlier, we used to swap clothes. Go off to work wearing a certain shirt and come back from work in the evening wearing something else on top. I remember that happening. It's quite interesting that the 1960s, that era, has always remained significant. The 50s, 50s, 70s, 80s, 90s, yeah. But everyone talks about the 60s. Now, I was there as a teenager, as I said, in the 60s, but I didn't appreciate at the time, I suppose, the era that I was in. It was going to become some really significant time in the whole of my life, the 60s. People have said to me over the years, oh, you were there. You were there in the 60s. Wow. As if it was fantastic. It was some fantastic time. Brilliant things happened. We had fun. At the time, we didn't realise that we were having fun. We did know we were having fun, but we didn't know what such a significant era that would become later on in our lives, the 60s. I can only speak for myself, of course, but for me, after the 60s, things fell apart. Well, not fell apart, but there was nothing like the 60s. The 70s were okay, 80s, 90s, well, sort of okay, I suppose. But there was nothing like the 60s ever again, not for me anyway. I suppose it's also got to do with age. I was a teenager, and I remember the clubs, the pubs, the live music, the bands playing in the clubs, leaving the club at 2 or 3 in the morning and possibly going home or not. If it was a warm summer night, to go and sit on the beach or in a park somewhere and have a cigarette. Again, to do with age, teenage years. Most of us didn't have a mortgage We didn't have to pay rent. We didn't have to buy food. We lived at home, give your mum something so much a week for your housekeeping sort of thing, but we didn't have responsibility. So presumably any teenage years, even teenage years today perhaps, for the teenagers now will be the best days of their lives. I don't know, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Any teenagers listening, raise rants at protonmail.com. Of course, you can't tell me whether or not these are the best days of your lives because you've got to be older to look back. But email me anyway. Another thing about the 60s that I didn't appreciate at the time were the pirate radio stations, the ships in the North Sea, Radio Caroline, Radio London. It was great music. It was on the radio, and it was the norm. It was just the norm to me. It wasn't anything special. It was, oh great, we got some decent radio stations. Whereas now, looking back, how I miss those radio stations, I really do. I've said before many times, I know over the years, the radio these days is rubbish. Well, no one listens to it, do they? There's nothing on medium wave AM anymore. On FM, VHF, FM, there's just the same old rubbish. So that's something else that I lived through. I experienced listening to the pirate radio stations in the 60s, but at the time I didn't appreciate it. I must just tell you this before I forget. I was talking to a friend the other day about podcasts and ideas and getting guests onto the show to have a chat to, and he said, I've got a couple of friends that are heavily into politics, and I instantly thought, no. But I let him carry on. He said, how about a couple of people in the red corner, a couple of people in the blue corner? He said, they're all best of mates, they're all friendly, but he said they are on totally opposite ends of the political spectrum. And he said, we could have a discussion. We'll come round your place, set up your microphone, and we'll have a debate. And from what he was saying, I said, it sounds a bit dangerous to me. I said, I think we're going to have an ambulance on standby to take people to the hospital. He was saying that they really do disagree and they have heated arguments. I declined his offer, of course, because I don't do politics on here. And apart from that, it sounded dangerous to me. I don't discuss or debate politics with anyone because you've got people on the left, people on the right. They're never going to agree. You can't win one over to your way of thinking. They can't win you over to their way of thinking. What's the point in debating everything? What's the point in even talking about it? It's just going to end up in an argument, or in this case, end up in a punch-up. Just moving on to something completely different. They were talking on the telly some weeks ago about sexting. That's sending explicit messages or photos or whatever to each other on your mobile phone. And that reminded me of a girl I once knew. Oh no, you're saying. I haven't said that for ages, have I? I once knew a girl. Here we go. No, seriously. This girl, she said to me, this was back in the early 70s, I suppose. She said, you've got a decent tape recorder, haven't you, and microphone? I said, yes, I have. Why? And she said, I've got some 3-inch tapes. Do you remember the reel-to-reel tapes, the 3-inch spool-type tapes? And she said, I need to do some recording on each of the tapes. So I said, OK, but what about? Oh, I can't tell you that, I can't tell you. It all sounded rather odd. I thought perhaps she was going to sing or something and perhaps send the tapes off as demo tapes. I didn't know what she was doing. So she brought one tape round. She said, I'll be about 20 minutes or whatever. Can you go indoors and have a beer or something? Come back later, because I don't want you to hear what I'm doing. I said, OK, whatever. I went indoors. I don't know what I did. Had a cup of tea, I think. Eventually went back out and she'd finished. Great, she said, thanks, I've done that. I've got some more tapes, which I'll do at another time. The next time she wanted to do a tape, I had no idea what was on the recording, but the next time she wanted to make a recording, I had a cassette tape recorder and I left that on under the bench in the shed so I could record what she was recording, if you see what I mean. She wasn't a girlfriend of mine, she was just one of the crowd in the local pub, nothing to do with me as a girlfriend as such, but she knew I was into Well, I was into pirate radio stuff, and she knew I had a decent tape recorder, a decent microphone and whatever. The recording that she made, I listened to the cassette tape once she'd gone, and it was what we would call today, I suppose, sexting. She was telling naughty stories onto a tape, and I later discovered she was making some money by selling these tapes. I don't know how much for, but locally she was selling these tapes to people. The story that she told, the one I listened to, was very raunchy. Well, it was more than very raunchy. And she had a good voice for it. She really did have a good voice for that sort of thing. When she wanted to make more recordings, I did confront her. I said, look, I owned up. I said, I recorded you on my cassette recorder. Oh, no, she said, oh, no. And she was embarrassed. She went red, highly embarrassed. But she did say that she was making quite a lot of money. She said that there were quite a lot of older men who enjoyed her stories. And enough said about that. The better, I think. But she was very resourceful, I thought. Good idea. She always had plenty of money. I don't know how she advertised them or what she did. I didn't really want to know. Although very resourceful, she was a strange girl. Mind you, most of the girls I knew back then were strange. Perhaps I was strange. I really don't know. I did meet some weird people back then. I don't mean weird as in on drugs. They weren't. I knew very few people who actually took drugs in the 60s. I didn't. Everyone tried a smoke, a cannabis cigarette. Everyone tried that, of course. It was just what you did in the 60s. But nothing worse than that. None of these Class A drugs. I didn't know anyone that was onto that sort of thing. Just going back to hairstyles again, that girl I was talking about with the tapes, she started going out with this chap who had a crew cut. Do you remember the crew cut? I suppose these days you'd call it a number one, a number two, where you shave, or not shave, you cut the hair all over, so there's about half an inch or whatever you want, all over your head. It was called a crew cut back then. I don't know why. Perhaps it was something to do with the ship's crew or something like that. But he had this crew cut, which was quite uncommon because, as I say, back in the 60s, most of us had long hair. I don't know which era that came from. Probably the 50s or maybe the 40s. No, the 50s. That was the quiff, wasn't it? That's the Brill cream, the grease, going back to that. What was the other one? Vosine was shampoo, wasn't it? There was another grease thing you could put on your hair. Awful stuff. In fact, the trains on the train, on the back of the seats where your head would rest against the cushion at the back of the seat, do you remember the white little cloths they would have? I forget what they're called. They were to keep people's hair off the upholstery because all these people had Brill cream and all this grease would come off on the back of the seats on the train. I remember they had BR embroidered into them, British Rail. Those were the days. And of course they could be removed every so often, probably at the end of each day, and then washed, laundered, as they used to say. I remember on Victoria Station, I went there with my grandfather, and I saw this sign, wash and brush up, 4p. 4D, it said. Who remembers that? 4p. In the old money, in the good old days. Wash and brush up, 4p. I remember seeing milk churns on the platform when I was a kid at the railway station. That's showing my age, you're thinking. How old are you? When was this? 1800 and what? The milk train used to come into the station early morning, and the paper train. With the newspapers, the paper train would come, was it 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, dump all the newspapers on the platform. And I'm not going back to 1860. This is the 1950s I'm talking about, when I was a kid. So relatively speaking, it's not that long ago, is it? What is long ago, relatively speaking, is the dinosaurs. So it's not that old. I'm not talking about, 3, 4, 5 million years ago. I said about half an hour ago I'd talk to Tricia in a minute about the 70s, the 80s, the fashion, the hair. But she's now gone downtown with her mother for coffee, and they're coming back here for lunch. I might have to follow her around the house with my handheld recorder. No, I will get her before the hour is up. I'll get her up here in front of the other microphone, and she could have a chat about the 70s and the 80s. back to fashion for men, well, for me anyway, in those days there were tailored shirts. Who remembers tailored shirts? They'd go in at the waist. These days I need them to go out at the waist, but we won't talk about that. They'd go in at the waist, and jackets would go in at the waist. So when you button the jacket up, it was shaped, or a bit like a lady's waist and hips, in at the waist, and then the jacket would flare out a little bit. I like that. I like old-fashioned clothes from the 1800s and going back even further. Some of the women's clothes, the dresses were fantastic, like 500,000 buttons all down the front. You've seen that sort of thing. Do you ever watch, what's it called? Miss Scarlet and the Duke? That's set in the 1800s, I believe. Some of the dresses she wears are amazing. Loads of buttons down the front, and the padded shoulders. Of course, we had the padded shoulders, didn't we? When was that? Like the 70s or the 80s? And some of the men's clothes back then were really nice. These days, a lot of the clothes I see men wearing in particular are just rags. Some old T-shirt on top with writing all over it, and some old jeans that don't seem to fit very well. Sounds like I'm talking about myself now. I remember once I was in the garden. Trish was in the house here with her mum and her sister. I came in from the garden and they're laughing at me. I'd been doing some digging out there. I think we were redoing the whole garden. And I said, "What's funny? What are you laughing at?" And Trish's sister said, "Why are you wearing your T-shirt not only inside out, but back to front?" I hadn't realised. I just threw on this old T-shirt to go and do some gardening, inside out and back to front. Bob, if you're listening, I haven't forgotten you mentioned about having a page where all the old episodes of podcasts are archived, to use your word. I'm not quite sure how to do it. I'm going to have a look at the Podbean website where the episodes are hosted. I'll have a look at that. They are all listed. Several of you have said, "How can I find the older copies?" Also, several people, or many people over the years have said, "Why don't you do a podcast about Christmas? Or why don't you do one about summer holidays in a caravan?" I've done them. Obviously, people aren't finding the earlier episodes. I've been doing this now for 5 years. It's 5 years this April, but next month. Struth, 5 years. And there are many, many early episodes. They're all still there. I haven't deleted them. But people are having a job to find them. So I haven't forgotten, Bob. I am kind of looking into what I can do about that. It wants a whole page, really, of, I don't know, I'll work on it. Nothing to do with fashion, I know, or hairstyles, but the music back in the 60s. The 60s were, or are, iconic. That's the word I was looking for earlier, iconic. You mention any decade, and it's the 60s that stands out for so many different reasons. The music in particular. The Beatles, the Stones, Bee Gees, Beach Boys. So much music, so many different bands. Huge bands that were hugely successful. We don't seem to have that anymore. But, as so many people say, of course, times have changed. You have to move on with the times. Everyone moves on with the times except me. No, I move on with the times to an extent. I just don't like these times. As I've said so many times before, I don't like the cars these days. Yes, they work, they're reliable, but they're all grey, plastic, miserable, dreadful looking cars, aren't they? And talking of girls, which I'm going to again now, I wasn't but I will, girls these days all seem to wear jeans. I hardly ever see anyone in a skirt or a dress. It's all jeans. The jeans industry must be doing extremely well because everyone wears jeans. Ripped jeans, tight jeans, flared jeans, any old jeans, they all wear jeans. I used to like the different clothes. Anyway, let's not bang on about the mini skirts in the 60s. Those were the days. I remember at one stage in the 60s, I wore a cravat. Goodness knows why. A cravat, I mean, it just wasn't me. It wasn't hippie. I only wore it once or twice. It was given to me. And I sort of got it, in my shirt, the shirt collar open at the top with this cravat thing round my neck. And I don't know, it wasn't me. I only wore it a couple of times. And I remember people saying, "What's that? What you got that on for?" But what I did, I had a what was it called? Like a neck scarf. You put this thing, you twist it, and you put it round your neck with like a gold ring, and you do that up to your neck. It was I forget what they were called, like a neck scarf, sort of things that gypsies used to wear. I like some of the gypsy clothes. They look good, and their hair. Gypsies' hair always looked good back then. You don't see so many now. And then the kipper tie, the big shirt collar, and the kipper tie. I remember that. This huge wide tie and these big collars on the shirt. That was all strange. Again, that wasn't really me. It suited some of the lads. One chap in particular, Jeff, he had this moustache that dragged down like, is it Jason? Do you remember Jason King? I forget his real name. A programme on the telly, wasn't it? He'd fold his shirt cuffs back over his jacket. Do you remember that, Jason King? And a lot of people started doing that. They wear a jacket and fold the shirt cuffs back over the jacket. I did it for a while. It sort of looked stupid. It did. It sort of looked stupid. It suited some people. As I say, this friend with the moustache, the Jason King moustache, he always wore a suit. This is when I was at the college doing the electronics thing. He always wore a suit and a white shirt and a tie. Who was that chap in Please Sir? Do you remember the programme Please Sir? Duffy, Sharon, Frankie Abbott. And there was a chap there who always wore a suit and a tie, one of the students in the class. I forget his name, because he used to say to the teacher, Hedges, wasn't it? He used to say, get yourself a decent suit, sir. Do you remember that? Looking back at the old days, the things on telly, the hair fashion, the style of clothes, music, everything, I think as I've got older, I look back more and more. So you youngsters listening to me now, when you're older, you'll start looking back to your youth and later years, because you can't now because you haven't had those later years. But when you get older, you'll start looking back. People say, oh, why do old people always bang on about their days? Oh, when I was a boy, when I was a girl. I think it's because as you get older, you've more to look back on, and you've seen a lot of changes, as I have. An amazing amount of change from the 50s to now. Every single aspect of life, music, houses, cars, everything, fashion, the whole lot, every single thing has changed dramatically, really. Well, I suppose hairstyle, has that changed? People still have a short back and sides, and a lot of men these days, Tricia was pointing this out the other day, a lot of men that are beginning to go bald, quite badly bald, I suppose, they shave their heads completely. And to be honest, it looks better. I think it looks far better. Our science teacher, the egghead chap, with the hair just round the sides and the back of his head, it really did accentuate his bald bit on top. Had he shaved the whole lot off, we probably wouldn't have called him egghead. We'd probably called him something else. But do you see what I mean? I think if you're going bald on top, and it is quite dramatic, I suppose. Can you go dramatically bald? Or bald dramatically? I don't know. Split the infinitive. It's best to shave the whole lot off, isn't it? I think it looks all right, actually. It looks good. I finally tracked Tricia down so we can talk about the 70s and 80s, because I was a teenager in the 60s. And to be honest, I don't remember much about the 70s. So what did you wear? Bay City Rollers trousers.
Well, when I was about 13, 14, the Bay City Rollers were the big band of the time. They had their own rather unique look with stripy socks and crop trousers with tartan round the edges and up the sides. So, of course, I had to have some of those, and my grandmother made me some.
And you met a couple of the Rollers, didn't you? Or all of the Rollers?
Not when I was 12, 13, 14. I couldn't really I wasn't allowed to go to the concerts. They never did anything down here. It was all up in London or further away. But in the 90s, they started doing tours again, and they turned up just up the road from where I lived, so I had to go and see them there.
Yeah, indeed.
And I managed to get my photo, get
good.
Pictures of them for...
Yeah. And did you wear your Doc Martens?
When I was at school, my uniform was always a variation on a theme. It was a purple blouse, a grey jumper, a grey skirt.
Purple blouse, not
yes.
white.
No. At our school, we had the 5 houses, and
Right.
each house you wore a blouse, or in the case of the boys, a tie, relative to the colour of your house. My house was Chantry, so it was purple, so I had a
see.
purple blouse. However, I didn't like to sort of follow the
No, you
herd,
did what you
so
like.
I wore a black cardigan, a black skirt, and a white blouse.
Okay. When did these dungaree things come in? Because I can't remember. I do remember dungarees, but what year?
That was in the 80s. That was the Dexys Midnight Runners and Bananarama influence.
Just going back to the Doc Martens, you said something the other day about eyelets.
It was a 16 eyelet boot.
Is that good?
Well, it meant that it was higher up your leg.
Oh, I see. So the more eyelets, the better.
Yeah, well, if you think it's lace holes, isn't it? The
Yeah.
eyelets. So if you had the normal boots that came to ankle height, I think they were about 10 or 12. But you could get the 16 eyelet boots, which were up to about halfway up your calf.
And that was some sort of status symbol, was it? Well, the more eyelets, the better.
I just liked them. I just preferred them. I mean, I used to wear football socks and Doc Marten boots with a skirt
Right.
to school.
Funnily enough, I did an episode on tomboys recently. Anyway, moving on.
Well, I think it was in protest because platforms in the 70s, platforms were very much the thing. So, of course, me being me, I always wanted to get the highest, most outlandish platforms you could. And I had this pair
course.
with 6-inch heels and like almost 3-inch platforms. You know, walked a bit like Herman Munster. And I had to keep to paths and pavements and flat surfaces because if I tried walking across a school field,
fall over.
it was bumpy and it could be a bit dangerous. And we were told we weren't allowed to wear them, so I decided to go the opposite. I thought, well, lots of the boys wore Doc Marten boots. I thought, right, well, I'm going to wear Doc Marten boots. And I thought to make a point, I will wear the high leg ones, which I did.
Yeah, excellent. And what about your hair? It was not. Was it long?
No, I had my hair short.
Oh, short, yeah.
I had it quite short. During my Bay City roller phase, shall we say, I had it about shoulder length with the spiky on top, a bit like Rod Stewart, David Bowie, that sort of style. It was longer at the side but short and spiky on the top. Then towards the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, it was very short. It was slightly longer on top, but razor cut at the back. And
yes.
there was a fashion thing that came in the early 80s, rat tails, where you had your hair shaved, very short at the back, but you had one long bit
I remember.
that you put into like a plait or plaits, and you had this at the back, which was a rat tail, because I can remember my dad keep threatening he was going to get a pair of scissors and cut it off.
I remember the rat tail thing, yeah. Excellent. Okay, that's great. Just to add a little bit to the 70s and 80s. Thanks, Trish.
You're welcome.
My recollection of the 70s, 80s, even 90s isn't too good for some reason. Anyway, good. Let's move on. You know this Cheltenham race thing that's on at the moment, Cheltenham races? Well, apparently up until 2018, they had Wednesday, which was Ladies' Day, which is good. Ladies' Day, I like that. That's where they wore all the special clothes and the funny hats and what are they called? Fascinators. I've always thought that ordered some feather or something you put in your hair. It's called a fascinator. Well, in 2018, they decided to call it Festival Wednesday instead of Ladies' Day, which seemed a bit odd. I remember at the time a lot of people up in arms about that, the ladies in particular, of course. Now they're calling it Style Wednesday, apparently because it's gender what do you call it? I don't know what it's called. Anyway, Style Wednesday, non-gender specific. Goodness me, why do we have to change everything? They change the names of pubs. They change the names of streets. You have a street name, it's Blog Street. It's been that for 250 million years. Some idiot comes along and calls it something completely different. The names of pubs. You can no longer say, I'll tell you where that shop is. It's a little shop opposite the Coach and Horses. No, it's not a little shop opposite the Coach and Horses now. It's a little shop opposite the Beetroot and Snail. What? Where's that? Well, it used to be the Coach and Horses. Oh, I know the Coach and Horses. Yeah, well, it's the Beetroot and Snail or some such a ridiculous name. Why do we have to have everything changed? They'll be wanting to change the names of towns next. What will the Isle of Man be? There we are, the Isle of Man. That'll have to be changed to the Isle of People. I know I'm laughing, but it's not funny. Manchester will become People Chester or Human Chester or whatever. It's crazy. The world's gone mad. I really don't know what's happened. It's all sad, really. Imagine back in the 50s saying to people, when we get to 20, 23, 20, whatever, it's all going to go balmy. Nothing will be accepted. Street names will be changed. Everything will be changed. Everything will be, what is it? What is that expression? Non-gender specific? I don't know. No men, no women. I think that's what it means. I won't bang on about that anymore because that's all we hear on the telly all the time, isn't it? The NHS going on about chest feeding and goodness knows what. Let's talk about shoes. Do you remember chisel toe shoes? Winkle pickers, of course, were in the 1950s. I did have a pair of winkle pickers, even though by the time I wore them, mid-60s, they were out of date and people were saying, well, what you got those on for? Are you a teddy boy? No, I'm not a teddy boy. It's just that I had a pair of winkle pickers, second-hand ones, given to me that happened to fit. And I rather liked them. They were really pointed. You probably remember them. If you don't, if you weren't there, if you're young like me, then you've probably seen photos of them or whatever. What I liked was the chisel toe shoes. So imagine the winkle picker, but cut it off so there's about an inch. Of course, we're in millimetres. That way you can change it. You'll have to look that up. About an inch, sort of flattened, cut off, if you like, chisel toe. They were nice. I did like the chisel toe shoes. Then we had moccasins. Do you remember moccasin shoes? In fact, I'm wearing a pair of moccasins now. And people say, oh, you've got your slippers on. No, I haven't got my slippers on. If I go to someone's house, oh, you've got your slippers on. No, they are shoes. They are moccasin slip-on type shoes, not slippers. But of course, back in the 60s, boots were the thing. Pull-on boots, elasticated each side. You probably remember those. Not necessarily Cuban heel. A lot of them were. I liked them. I loved the Cuban heel boots. But they were just pull-on boots. And when you sat down and your trousers or your jeans come up slightly, they didn't show your socks because you got the boots on. That's what I liked about them. I don't like showing socks off. Mind you, these days people do show socks off, don't they? Because they've got all sorts of writing and pictures all over their socks. Just briefly, for the gardeners out there, Trish and I this morning, we went out, we bought some compost, and aubrietia, loads, I can't remember what the other plants were, loads of plants, cost a fortune. In the old days, you used to go to a family-run nursery where they grew all the plants themselves from seed or from cuttings. You could ask for advice, and the chap there, he would know everything about gardening, all about the plants, what to plant where, what needed sun, what didn't need sun, all that stuff. These days, there's no one to ask. Well, there are people to ask, but they don't know. They don't know any more than me. I hate it. I hate all these garden centres. They're atrocious places. There are one or two family-run nurseries left. Anyway, the sun was shining, so when we got home, we did a bit of digging over and filling up tubs and troughs and our raised bed, and we planted everything, so just waiting now for the sun to come out. It was a little bit sunny this morning, which was nice. In the old days, let's go back to the 50s again, shall we? Because we love the 50s, don't we? In the old days, most people had lovely front gardens. They'd plant wallflowers and marigolds and all sorts of lovely flowers in their front garden. So you're walking down the street and you can look and admire. I still do that in the summer. I walk down the street and round the few roads looking and admiring people's work. Unfortunately, I used to say few and far. No, what was it I used to say? Tricia would correct me. Far and few between. No, few and far, but I don't know what I said. There aren't many. That's what I'm trying to say. There aren't many gardens now that really look nice, where people have worked hard and got some flowers and nice shrubs that are all pruned and looking good. I don't know. So many people now, they just have grass, long grass and weeds, which is great for the insects, of course, because they love all that. They love the land to be left alone. But it does, especially in the front, it does look a little bit rough. I think if they did that in the back garden, that would be nice. Anyway, there we are. We bought a load of plants. This year, unlike last year, do you remember last year? I grew cabbages, Savoy cabbages. Wonderful. They were getting bigger and bigger, lovely, lovely green cabbages, till the butterflies, the cabbage white butterflies, laid eggs all over them. Caterpillars, within minutes, devoured the lot. Well, not minutes, the whole lot, eaten. Oh, all that work, watering them and looking after things. The onions were nice. I did grow onions. Anyway, you don't want to hear about that. But just going back to the 50s, that's what people did. They all grew their own food. You go into anyone's back garden and there was something, even if it was just runner beans, they were growing something to eat. I remember a neighbour of ours, this old lady, years ago, she grew cannabis in her front garden. She did. She wasn't aware. It was some kind of bird seed she had, because back then bird seed contained cannabis seeds. And she had this cannabis in the front garden. I must admit I didn't notice it. I didn't look that closely at her front garden. I had our own to deal with. It was only when this local copper on his bicycle pulled up outside, she told me this, knocked on her door and said, "Do you know what you're growing?" And of course she went out there and said, "Well, flowers, weeds, I don't know what that is. That's the bird seed." And he said, "That's cannabis." And apparently, according to her, she said, "Oh, I'll make some cakes." And he said, "No, you won't, not with that," because they used to be, well, I say used to be, probably still are, cannabis cakes, aren't there? I've never tried one. I wouldn't mind trying a cannabis cake. That'd be quite interesting, wouldn't it? Sit there on a winter evening, sit there by the fire watching telly, a cup of tea and a cannabis cake. Imagine that. No, we mustn't do that. Is it illegal? I think it's still illegal, isn't it? It is in Britain anyway. You're not allowed to grow and eat, chew, smoke or make cakes out of cannabis stuff. I don't know. There's all this talk over the years of certain things becoming legal or not illegal, I should say. But I don't know whether it'll ever happen. We're still watching talking pictures on the telly, the old Scotland Yard stuff and Colonel March, all the black and white films. I like the introduction to, is it Scotland Yard, where the chap says, "London, the world's finest city." London. It's great. What I like, I've said this before, I won't bore you, but I love seeing the old cars, the buildings. Of course, a lot of the buildings have been pulled down to make way for some sort of atrocity. Again, it's idiots behind desks, isn't it? Somewhere there must be a big office block full of little offices with desks, and each one has an idiot behind it. One is an architect, so he designs things that look like prison blocks and dreadful, awful buildings. Then you have another idiot behind another desk in another office next to his mate, and he's blocking off the streets with big wooden and concrete structures called LTN. What is it? Something low traffic neighbourhood or some such rubbish. Then in another office, you got a chap renaming the streets. Oh, we won't have that. We won't have King Charles the so-and-so street. We're going to call that Mrs. Blogg Street, because Mrs. Blogg used to live there and make cakes. I'd really like to know where this office block of idiots is. I could go in there and sort them out. Actually, I do know of one place where there's a load of offices and chambers. What's it called? Oh yes, the Houses of Parliament. You'll find lots of idiots behind desks there. That's not treason, is it? I can say that, can't I? Won't be arrested for treason, slung in the tower. Those were the days. Off with his head. When I first started out at work in the 60s, out of all the people I knew, there wasn't anyone who was out of work. I didn't ever hear of people being out of work. People would change jobs. Even if someone got the sack, they go straight down to what was called the labour exchange, and they get a job the same day, basically. I don't remember anyone being out of work for more than like a few hours, I suppose. Whereas these days, what were they saying on the telly the other day? I'm always quoting the telly, aren't I? Or trying to quote what they said on the telly, but I forget. They were saying something about 6.5 million people, I think it was 6.5, don't go to work. They don't want to go to work. And there's nothing wrong with them. They're not ill or anything. They just don't want to go to work. I suppose one reason back then if you didn't work, you could, I don't know, was there a dole? Did you sign on and have dole money? I don't know. I was never out of work. But I think whatever it was called, the benefits, the social stuff, the dole money, it was very little. So you couldn't really survive on that for long. So you had to go and get a job. Whereas these days, it seems to be the other way round. You can get more. It's not funny. You can get more by not working than you can by actually going out to work. Something's gone very wrong, I think. We're coming up to the hour, so I shall end it here. Raise rants at protonmail.com if you want to contact me. I shall see you on Wednesday. We're heading for April, are we? January, February, March, April. Yes, we're heading for April. Take care, look after yourselves, don't get caught, and I shall see you on Wednesday. Bye-bye for now.